This is an ABC podcast.
Hi there, welcome to Life Matters. Global leaders are meeting in Glasgow for the UN Climate Change Conference. The G20 meeting in Rome ahead of that conference couldn't agree on strong targets, with different nations pushing different agendas. Our Prime Minister eventually decided he would go to Glasgow. New Zealand PM Jacinda Ardern isn't going. But does it matter? Are politicians the ones we look to for leadership on climate action? Or are there others in your community leading the charge? This is Radio National.
The following Life Matters talkback was recorded earlier. If you'd like to contribute to the discussion, please send your emails or voice memos to lifematters@abc.net.au. Look forward to hearing from you. That's lifematters@abc.net.au.
It's crunch time for climate change policy on the world stage. The UN's climate summit is afoot and the G20 leaders are stalling. So we'd like to hear from you. Who do you look to for leadership on climate change? Is it governments? Or are there others in your community leading the way, whether it's in business or volunteer organisations or religious groups, here or overseas? Who are the people or groups or areas that you look to where you see real action and leadership happening on climate change? And with us today are two guests who are pretty steeped in this area of climate change and negotiation. John Lydon is the co-chair of the Climate Leaders Coalition. He's in London. He'll be attending the Glasgow Summit in a personal capacity. John, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Hilary. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great to have you. Dr. Christian Downey is an Associate Professor at the Australian National University School of Regulation and Global Governance in Canberra, focusing on climate policy. Christian, great to have you here.
Great to be on the program, Hilary.
Now, Dr. Downey, the G20 leaders just met in Rome ahead of this UN climate summit, and they've only committed to reach net zero by around mid-century. What might this mean for the Glasgow outcome?
Well, there's a few good things that came out of the G20 summit, and I think there's a few things, as you mentioned, that are of concern. If we're going to get success at Glasgow, we're going to need all the major emitters, so that's all of the countries that met in Rome overnight, to commit not just to 2050. The net zero target by 2050 is really just a ticket to entry. What we really need is all of these countries to step up and take stronger targets for 2030. That is, what are they going to do in the next few years, in the next decade, to reduce carbon pollution? Without that, there's really zero chance that the world will hold the rising global temperatures to below 2 degrees. We're also going to need to see these major countries support developing countries with the finance and the technologies to enable them to transition to clean energy and to adapt to the severe impacts of climate change that they're already feeling. That's the severe flooding in many areas, the prolonged droughts that many people in Australia are used to as well. Now, there are signs of hope. The US and China did come on board at the G20 and agree to phase out new international finance for coal projects overseas. That is a really big step. On the other side, they didn't agree to phase out coal in the near term. And that's the really big sticking point. We know that Europe, the US, the UK has been pushing for that. And some countries, including Australia, have been resisting that action. So there's some signs. There are some signs of hope, but until I think the US and China can come on board, we're not going to see the progress that we need to avert the worst impacts of climate change, which scientists are warning are with us now and are only going to get much worse in the future.
And Dr. Downey, why do you think they pulled back on what was quite a strong push earlier for firm targets by 2050? Which countries got their way?
Well, they're all committing to net zero by 2050. They've also all signed on to try and keep global temperatures to around 1.5 degrees. But we have seen a group of countries, often referred to as climate laggards, Brazil, Russia, Saudi Arabia, obviously one of the biggest oil producers in the world, and sadly our own country, Australia, pushing back on some of the stronger language, particularly around 2030 targets and particularly around phasing out coal at home. Now, one of the reasons is, of course, that countries like Brazil, Russia are some of the biggest oil and gas producers in the world. Australia, of course, is one of the largest coal exporters in the world. And these countries so far are refusing to, acknowledge, how severe these climate impacts are going to be and take the necessary action. But it's also, particularly for Australia, it's a really missed opportunity. Australia has some of the best solar and wind resources in the world. We could be a renewable power, exporting clean electricity clean hydrogen, and a range of products overseas. But to date, unfortunately, the government has failed to put in place a plan to make that happen.
Well, and presenting this program, it becomes clear that a lot of Australians have a really clear understanding of climate change and its mechanics and its effects, and are quite keen to see action. And we're really interested today in how that happens, how particular leaders push that agenda forward and get real action happening on emissions reduction, for example. We'd love to hear from you too, if you're listening to our discussion today, about the leadership that you're seeing around you, whether that is political leadership, whether it's at local, state or federal level, or whether it's elsewhere in your community from different groups or individuals or projects that you're seeing that you think is delivering the goods when it comes to climate change action. And you've been hearing from Dr. Christian Downey from the ANU School of Regulation and Global Governance, which focuses on climate policy. John Lydon's with us too, co-chair of the Climate Leaders Coalition, who's going to be at the summit. He's in London at the moment. John, tell me a bit about the members of your coalition.
The Climate Leaders Coalition is a group of 33 chief executive CEOs and their companies. And all of those companies have committed to the Paris Agreement. As part of being in the coalition, they either have targets or they commit to set targets within a year. And the point of this coalition is those chief executives help each other, the companies help each other to advance their own climate action within their backyards, within their companies. So the idea came from the Global B Team, which is a social impact foundation formed by Richard Branson and others, some years ago. And Lynette Main is the co-chair of the B Team here in Australasia. She asked David Thodey and myself to get together and, what could we do as business and how can we help these companies help each other? And because David and I had both been part of things like the Male Champions of Change, we really saw the potential for companies to come together and, do the work, right? Really help each other advancing the work rather than wait for others to act.
It's a really interesting group of companies, Coles, Citigroup, people like Santos, AGL, Engie, so power companies as well, industrial, finance, technology, research, advisory, lots of different groups. But you advocate for a responsible and equitable, I'm quoting, transition to a low emissions economy. What would you like to see come out of Glasgow?
Well, the coalition, but particularly in a personal capacity, I think we do want to see action taken by legislators and governments. But beyond that, Glasgow is going to be a great place to get ideas and to see what some of the better technologies are, the better ideas, what companies are doing globally. And I'd love to see even faster adoption of some of those by our members in Australia. I think our members are also doing some really interesting things, as you might see if you go on our website and look at our roadmap to 2030, where those 33 members are really sharing very practical things they are doing in the hope of giving ideas to each other and to other businesses too.
We might have a look at some of those as the hour progresses. But we've got lots of people on the line wanting to share their stories of where they're seeing leadership on climate action and around Australia and elsewhere. They've called in on 1300 22 5576 from the daylight saving states. Let's go to Zoe in Sydney. Zoe, tell us what you've been seeing where you live.
So where I usually live in Tasmania, I've been seeing such amazing effort and work by local grassroots movements led by young people. So Seed Mob, Australian Youth Climate Coalition, No Gas Across the Bass, School Strike for Climate, the list goes on, like the Pacific Climate Warriors, 350.org. And a lot of these movements are led by young people because we're sick of hearing that it's too late to do anything for our future. We've seen so much stalling from the government, especially in COP26, and so much focus on technology, many of which aren't even developed yet. There's not enough focus on people. And so actually, what we're trying to see is a better future for young people. And, there are young people from Seed Mob and from AYCC who are fighting huge fracking projects, focusing on keeping fossil fuels in the ground and protecting land from pollution, which is where it matters most.
So I'm just going to clarify some of those. AYCC, that's the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, and Seed Mob, that's an Indigenous group, isn't it, that's trying to make change on climate?
Yeah, so that's actually the first independent environmental organisation led by young Indigenous people. So I'd really recommend supporting them first and foremost. They're probably doing the most important work across this continent right now on climate.
And Zoe, it sounds like you're really involved with a lot of these groups, very well informed and engaged with it. What kind of thing do you think makes a good leader in that field? Is it someone who can kind of come out strongly as an individual, or does it take a bit more than that?
Oh, I don't think it's someone who comes out strongly as an individual at all, actually. I think what it is about leadership in the climate space particularly is collective action, and it's kind of hard to pin down what that looks like, but supporting other people around you and making connections with other people around you, not focusing on, whether I use a plastic straw or not today. It's not going to make much difference if there aren't a whole lot of other people who, are stopping the the oil from being extracted to be made into plastic in the first place. So, you got to think about the big picture and think about who do I know who can help me to achieve these goals, and how can we work together with lots of different people to make things happen. It's not about the individual at all.
Yeah, no more wrangling on Facebook about who's got plastic straws.
You can definitely wrangle on Facebook, but don't blame and shame the little guys. Blame and shame the big guys.
Yep,
the
Zoe,
corporations, the governments.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Zoe.
Thank you.
We've got so many calls on the board. Let's skip through a few more and then we'll check in with our guests again. Gillian is in Warrnambool, down the south west coast of Victoria. Gillian, in the political sphere, you've got some ideas. Tell us about that.
Yes, and I thoroughly agree with what the person said just now.
Zoe.
Yes, Zoe, because otherwise we'll be following a gas-led extinction under our present Prime Minister. But I would see a need for people to vote for independents and Greens first, and then let the votes flow through to the major parties, and that way the independents and the Greens get the vote. But what we really need to do is look at reducing our own consumption. And lots of people are now buying houses which are new, which are still being built all around Warrnambool in the Western District. And instead of facing north so they can get the winter sun, which can heat them up, and having overhanging eaves to keep them cool in the summer, 25% of the energy that is produced is actually from heating and cooling houses, and it's an unnecessary thing. All we have to do is site our houses better and build them better so that they don't need artificially heating and cooling, and we can reduce our emissions by about 25%. So we need the building industry on board, and we need the councils and the state governments to actually take some action on this, because they've not been listening.
And it sounds like, Gillian, you're saying we can all, as individuals, be leaders as well and talk to our friends and family and our networks and make some change on the ground.
Absolutely, and we shouldn't be spending a lot of money on things which are unnecessary. All we need is clothes every few years, and we just need to buy our food. We don't need to buy a lot of the gadgets and trinkets and all the things that we're wasting energy on producing and that go to landfill.
Yep, plastics made of fossil fuels. Gillian, thank you for calling.
No worries.
This is Life Matters on Radio National. Susan's in far south Tasmania. And Susan, you've got a beautiful individual that you'd like to tell us about.
Oh, hello, Hillary. It's lovely to have the opportunity to blow the trumpet about my darling son, who has started a company with two other young men, born from a passion of the environment. When he was about 8, he had a visit from a member of the government staff. I'm not sure who he was. I was actually out that day when he arrived, but still, that happened. And he said to this, he'd written a letter, and I encouraged him to write this letter, and we posted it. And this man arrived, and he said, "What is it you want to do, Sam?" He said, "Well, I want to plant trees all along the highways so that we can have all that wasted land used for counteracting global warming." And he was 8 at the time. So
wow.
And now he's put out this wonderful company called the Good Car Co., which means that he's put more electric vehicles on the road. He and his partners have put more electric vehicles on the road than any other company. And he's just done it from sheer bloody mindedness.
And of course, we will say that we're not advocating for any particular car company here, but it's really interesting to hear how far your son has come. I assume he's not 8 anymore.
Oh, he's over 40, but he's still got that 8-year-old passion. It's wonderful. And I'm very proud of him, and I just thought this is a great opportunity to sing his praises, because mothers are very often in the position of being critics of their family, and, singing the praises has to be well balanced with some of that. But it's nice to be able to do it, Hillary. Thanks for the opportunity.
Oh, that's a pleasure. I wanted to ask you, Susan, too. I mean, it sounds like he's making change for the people who buy his products, but in a wider sense, do you think he's changing the conversations and perceptions around him as well?
Well, he's certainly changed mine, Hillary, because I have gas heaters and gas cooktops in my house. And he's encouraged me to put an electric heat pump in and change the gas heaters. And he's also said that that's not the way to go, Mum. Don't go gas. Go electric, because that's sustainable. So he has changed my view, and I'm quite a determined woman. So I think it's really great that he's having these conversations within his community. He's well respected, and I'm very proud of him.
Yep, one down, several million to go. But Susan, it's so lovely to see that ripple effect. Thank you for your call.
Thanks, Hillary.
Some great stories coming out today here on Life Matters. Love to hear from you too about leadership and change that you're seeing, whether it's at a community level or a government level of some kind, or elsewhere around the world or close to home. Sally's in Caulfield. Sally, is it someone in particular or a wider range?
It is a wide range, Hillary, but it's very encouraging to hear those other speakers, because they both use points. It is the individual's contribution, but it is the collective support. All through lockdown, I met on Zoom with 2 Extinction Rebellion groups. Yes, some of their extremes are seen as being disruptive and perhaps too extreme, and that's meaning that everything can be done on any level people are comfortable with. The older age group are quite happy to hold banners and do signs and talk to people in the street and that sort of thing. That's where I've been involved, and I think it has helped right back from the 80s when people were putting solar panels on their roof. We've pushed the envelope. The people, the public that want the change, we invest in it, and then eventually the politicians have to agree, or at least take it up. You know, it wasn't that long ago that politicians were denying climate change. In fact, some of them, a couple of them, still are holding everything back, unfortunately. But we have got wonderful opportunities of exporting power. All the figures have been done. We could make so much money. We could easily replace the jobs in coal. It doesn't have to be used as an argument against making the decision to start now. We've got the ingenuity, we've got the expertise. We just need the political will and, frankly, not to be held ransom by the political donations that come from fossil fuel companies. So that's my spiel.
Well, and clearly there is a lot of passion in the community and on our phone lines today. Thank you, Sally. I want to quickly
go. Survival.
Yes, I'm going to hear from Eleanor next, and then check in with our guest, John Lydon, and Dr. Christian Downey about leadership and how you get from an abstract idea about leadership on climate change to a concrete agreement of some kind. Eleanor in Sydney, welcome to you.
Hi, Hillary. How are you going?
Good. You're doing some research, I understand, that's very illuminating.
Yeah, I am. I've been doing a PhD for the last couple of years, actually working with a few communities that have transitioned or are in the process of transitioning away from coal. So one community in particular was, or is rather, Port Augusta in South Australia. So in 2015, they lost their remaining power plant, coal power plant, and the community now has about 13 different renewable energy projects in play in the area. So it's quite a successful transition if you look purely from this technological kind of aspect from fossil fuel to renewable energy.
Well, and can I ask, Eleanor, where did that come from? Was that the government coming in and going, OK, we'll put these projects in place and we'll transition you to a new economy, or was it more community-led?
Well, that's, the point that I was trying to make. So one key factor in my research across both of those sites is really that community leadership is such a powerful part of this transition, and particularly in just creating a more amenable environment with the community at large there. So there's a community group in Port Augusta, for example, that lobbied for over 5 years to get a particular technology there in replacement of the coal power station. Although that fell through, what it did do was create this social license, I guess, and the community was seen as a place that would be, welcoming of new technologies to come in. And then in the Latrobe Valley, it's a little bit different, but it's more about discourse. So there's individuals there that are really having bold conversations with their community members about what it might look like for that region to transition away from coal. And other community members have said that, it's empowering for them to have those conversations, but other community members have said, that's changed their minds and their perceptions about what the future could look like. Having these people, these community leaders really, hold the torch for a future away from coal power generation.
I actually know someone engaged in community engagement in the Latrobe Valley, and she's saying those are quite difficult conversations because there's been this long history in the valley of a particular industry, and people are really worried about what it might look like for their communities. How do you bridge that? And I guess is it a combination of just those conversations at community level, but bigger policy moves as well that gets you over the line?
Yeah, that's a good point, Hilary. So it's really multi-pronged. I guess in the Latrobe Valley, there's a history of privatisation and huge job losses that happened in the 90s, and that was a really traumatic event there. So there's a huge fear about what it might look like for the valley to lose that stability of the coal industry there. But what's happening are local community groups and, as I said, community leaders having conversations with other people in their community. But also there's been state government intervention when Hazelwood closed down, and they created a transition authority and invested significant money. And so even though there's mixed opinions about that, I think that it's shown that there's support and there's multi-level support, and another factor that we need to consider is also business investment in those regions. So you have, some policy mechanisms and some government funding in place. You have community leaders having conversations, and then business also investing so that people can see that there is job security and there is a future in their region beyond that current dominant paradigm, which is obviously fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, and it sounds like you can't rely completely on any one player. It has to be, as you said, a multi-pronged approach. Eleanor, thank you so much. It's really interesting to see the insights from your research in those two states. Thanks for calling.
Pleasure. Thanks, Hilary. See you later.
See ya. Lovely text too. Climate Action in South Gippsland. We're helping low-income households save energy and stay warm, very important in the valley, by auditing their houses and fixing drafts. We are called Cozy Homes. That's lovely. You're listening to Life Matters here on Radio National, and we're talking about what leadership looks like. And as we're hearing, it's very diverse when it comes to climate change. Our guests today are John Lydon, co-chair of the Climate Leaders Coalition, which is a group of businesses, quite diverse businesses, who are pushing for change in the sector, and Dr. Christian Downey, an associate professor at the ANU School of Regulation and Global Governance, which focuses on climate policy. Christian, you've worked as an advisor to several Australian government agencies and then in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. What kind of wrangling goes on behind the scenes ahead of a big summit like this Glasgow one that's underway at the moment? Can you paint a picture for us?
Yeah, sure. And let me start by just saying it's really nice to hear from all your callers about the fantastic stuff that's going on at a local level. So, yeah, it's nice to kind of try and think about what goes in behind closed doors in government. So take a step back, and we're thinking about Glasgow and what Prime Minister Scott Morrison and all international leaders will announce there. And political scientists often think about this as a two-level game. There's what takes place at the international table over in Glasgow, and there's what happens at the domestic table at home. And this idea was pioneered by a political scientist professor at Harvard, Robert Putnam. And the idea is to peer into this black box of domestic politics and see how the mechanisations take place. And there's kind of two things going on here. The first is we see the negotiations within the coalition government. So we've seen in recent weeks, of course, the Prime Minister negotiating with his colleagues in the Liberal Party room and the National Party to try and get a commitment to net zero, which he achieved, and potentially to try and get some further commitment to 2030, which he didn't. So we have those negotiations going on in the political level, but also we would have had in the lead up in the last few weeks, different government agencies, those that have portfolios that touch on climate issues, getting together and negotiating about what the government's position would be on some of the finer detail. So you typically have the Treasury Department, which would be having some input on what the economic impacts might be of any commitment. You'd have the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources, also looking at what some of the impacts might be on energy, on the industry sector and so forth. And of course, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. And all these agencies get together They have what's often referred to as an interagency discussion, and then they put up a document that's submitted to Cabinet for approval, and that ends up becoming what Australia's official position is. So yes, there's the net zero target, but there's all the finer detail about individual commitments in there.
And what come from the agencies, Christian? Does what that document that comes from the agencies and goes to the Prime Minister, how much does that change usually before it gets to Glasgow?
Well, what it normally has is it's got some room for flexibility and it's got some red lines. And so by red lines, I mean there's certain things that Cabinet will have approved that the government will not agree to. And I think we can see from the G20 summit that the government is going to be unwilling to commit to anything more by 2030, which is obviously a very unfortunate outcome for all of us that care about climate change. There'll also be some space for wriggle room, and perhaps that is how much finance Australia commits to developing countries. It might be on some of the rules around carbon markets. So there'll be some areas that negotiators in Glasgow have room to move on, and there'll be other things which are, as I said, often referred to as red lines that they simply can't cross.
John Lydon, I want to come to you for a moment. We were talking about some of the things that your members are involved in. What kind of targets are you seeing businesses set? Are they hovering around the levels that governments are setting or going beyond?
Thank you. Well, first of all, what wonderful, inspiring, beautiful stories from your listeners about leadership in the community. And I think business really wants to listen and learn from those. Now, in terms of targets, so out of our 33 members, we've got, I think, already 28, I think, have set targets the others have committed to do, and they're all consistent with the Paris Agreement. So pretty much at least what we're seeing governments committing to. What's very interesting is the action in this decade. And you'll see in our roadmap to 2030 that we're already seeing these companies taking action now, knowing that this is the critical decade and we do need to be reducing our emissions considerably during 2030. So some of our members have got even net zero by 2030, one or two of them net zero in the early part of this decade. And this is just all part of business that wants to make the change now. It's not about pushing or advocating others to make the change, but this is business really making the change to a healthy, sustainable, low-carbon future.
I was having a little look at some of the initiatives that are in place, and some of them are really interesting. So looking at the end-to-end value chain, all products in the supply chain aiming for carbon neutral, engaging as suppliers, so you can look towards a net zero supply chain by 2050. But I noticed that one big property company, what they're doing is buying 100% renewable energy for the majority of its operational portfolio in some states. Aren't some of those initiatives basically the least that a really big company could be doing? I mean, that sounds like a basic thing that a lot of households are already doing.
Yeah, I think that company is doing a lot more as well, right? So that's just one of the initiatives. So it's actually quite hard when you're a big corporate to make sure you are buying 100% renewable energy.
Is it
quite
though?
tricky.
Is it? I mean, you've got a lot of resources to be able to investigate that.
Well, one thing we did as the coalition is put together a task force where the companies that had achieved it were able to share how they did it. And that way we get best practices. And now you'll find all the members have access to those best practices. And we can even share those beyond the current membership as well. So that's just one part of it, as you say, accessing renewable energy. There's far more that these businesses are doing and will do.
And John, how much can business do without government? Do you need policy backup?
Look, it's always good to act with government, with the community, with big investors and shareholders, the public sector. So that's always ideal. And I love the way Eleanor put it about the regions. And I think when you get all those different stakeholders coming together, we can really do a lot. Now, we're not going to wait for government. And I think most businesses know that they have to act on their own operations. What we mean when we talk about a just and equitable transition is also making sure that business is taking care of the employees, the regions, the communities in which they act. And hopefully through that, helping to reduce the fear, reduce a little bit of the sense of loss some communities and regions will have. And that ought to enable that multi-stakeholder action to happen.
We'll hear some more of those wonderful stories in just a moment. And if you'd like to share one with us of what leadership looks like for you around climate change, whether it's the individual level, the community, the government at various levels or on the world stage. Dr. Christian Downie, I wanted to ask you, though, Australia's often called a small player by people opposed to significant cuts to emissions. Is it? Does it matter what we do?
Yes, look, I'm glad you asked that question, Hilary, because it's often a claim that's put forward by really those that want to delay action. The short answer is it's not true. It's false. Australia is one of the top 20 emitters in the world, and our national emissions are around 1% of global emissions. Now, that might not sound like much, but it's also about the same as those of the UK or Brazil. So if our emissions don't matter, then neither do the emissions of the UK or Indonesia or almost any other country. And if you were to take that argument to its logical conclusion, essentially no country should act other than the US and China, which would mean that 60% of the rest of the world's emissions are left unchanged. So I guess that argument, every time I hear that argument, I think being put forward, I think we've got to remember that it's often being used as a little bit of a smokescreen. And we do have to remember that there's a lot of leadership going on in the community. It's fantastic to hear what Zoe and Gillian and Susan and others were talking about. But there's also a lot of misinformation that goes on. Some of that being pushed by business groups, particularly in the oil, gas and coal sector. We know for decades they've been running misinformation campaigns to confuse the science, to muddy the political waters, to delay action. So it's really important to kind of celebrate the good leadership, but also to highlight where we need industries that have been resisting action on climate change to get out of the way as well.
And Christian, just quickly, does that 1% of global emissions that we represent include emissions from the fossil fuels that we export?
No, it doesn't. And that's because of how the global greenhouse gas emissions are accounted under the Paris Agreement. Typically, how the accounting rules work is that it's only emissions that you burn at home are counted. Those that we export overseas, coal that we export to Japan or China or South Korea, they're calculated under their emissions. And this is why there's been a big push by a lot of NGOs, civil society groups, that Australia needs to think more carefully now about its exports, particularly of coal and gas. But the other issue is, of course, a lot of these decisions are being made for us. Because we've been delaying in this country for so long taking serious action, it's now China, it's now Japan, South Korea, our top 3 export markets for coal, have all signed on to net zero. They've all said they're going to buy much less of our products in the coming decades. So it doesn't make any sense for us to keep trying to market products that no one wants. It makes much more sense to go, look, we've got these abundant resources of solar and wind. Let's look at these technologies. Let's take advantage of these and let's transition to the economies and the technologies of the future. That's where Australia's got so much to gain. Rather than trying to continue to sell products to countries that we know have already said publicly don't want them for very much longer.
Our guest today, Dr. Christian Downie, Associate Professor at ANU's School of, I'm just going to check that detail, sorry Christian, School of Regulation and Global Governance, and John Lydon, Co-Chair of the Climate Leaders Coalition. He's in London. He's going to the conference in a personal capacity. What an interesting thing that would be to do. And we're hearing your stories today on leadership around climate change. Vivian is in Sydney. Vivian, you've got a particular group in mind. Tell us.
Well, I have several groups in mind, and a lot of them have been mentioned, but I would like to say I'm very glad to have this program where you're focusing on the leadership in the community, and I wish we had more of a media platform for them. Your ABC has a science show, a religion show, law report, but we don't have a climate action show showing what action is happening in the community, and there's a blockage between the activists, all of the ones we've mentioned from SEED and all of those, and I could mention Groundswell, Gloucester, and, the Australia Institute of Doctors for the Environment. There are so many of them, and I interview them all the time on my radio show, which is on community radio, and I've been doing it for 10 years, and I know these people, and they're absolute heroes.
Well, and Vivian,
I do to be on the radio.
I have heard of a lot of those groups because they do crop up from time to time in stories across the radio national landscape. And I guess the ABC is a different beast, isn't it, from community radio? But you're noticing something about a lot of these groups.
Yes, I am, and I think they have incredible persistence. I mean, for example, up in Queensland at the moment, the Cody McAvoy and the people from the Wangan Jagalingo are doing kind of ceremony, and others are gathering around them just to stop that Adani project, which may be stopped in the end by economic forces, as your guest has just said. But, what heroes they are to just keep it up. And they had a kind of a tour de Carmichael, where they had a few hundred people going up just to ride bikes up there on the roads around the Adani mines. So I think they're heroes. There's also Violet Coco and Leslie Mosley from Extinction Rebellion. They did get to the front page of the media with a burning pram, but they were really, I interviewed them and they were just so sincere. Violet's a young woman. She said, I just can't contemplate having children. And I think it's genuine for this younger generation that's how they feel about the future. And this was, like street theatre, but it was in Canberra.
And Vivian, you're seeing a lot of women, I understand.
I know that, yes. I'm the
That's all these women's names.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Julie Lyford's one I'd like to mention from Groundswell, Gloucester, and they actually won up at Gloucester. They pushed back a gas company there, AGL Gas, which was going to frack that landscape and contaminate the water downstream for many, many communities. So Julie Lyford, such bravery, and there was a book written about them. And Wendy Farmer in the Latrobe Valley, Amanda Cahill, who's working with all of those people up there to transition, and describing that transition is such a wonderful story for all the media to cover. It's a heroic story and it's happening. And yet, if you have to look at Australia at Glasgow, we're going to look like the pariah. We're not going to look like the, energetic country of people that I meet. On
Vivian, it's really wonderful to hear about some of these key players and some of the amazing things you've been seeing. I know there are a lot of blokes involved in those movements as well, but it's really interesting to highlight those names. Thank you.
One more, which is
I think we might have to move on, actually, Vivian. It's been lovely to hear about those people, but we do have a lot of people wanting to talk to us today. And I want to go to Hugh in Bega. Hugh, what are you seeing around you?
So I'm seeing a community that is an inspiration and will ultimately make the government irrelevant.
Really?
So picture this. The Transport Action Group based in Bega and also working in Tathra. You remember Tathra?
I do.
Was ahead of the Black Summer bushfires by 2 years. With the fire that went through there, has bushfires survivors for bushfire survivors for climate change, clean energy for eternity, whole lots of community people way ahead of the game. Now picture this: the Bega Tathra Beach Tram, 2-car tram, bike rack on the front, surfboard rack on the back.
Oh, lovely!
It's an ultralight tram. It floats on a cushion of compressed air. It runs on a 28-minute algorithm that goes from Bega Post Office to Tathra Post Office and back along a wildlife corridor. This tram has solar panels on the roof. It has the running gear underneath. It costs 10% of the standard tram infrastructure cost. It is totally achievable within a 3 to 5 year time frame if we move the existing capital that people put in their tanks, fuel tanks. What we're trying to do is move 90% of existing road journeys from single driver, one bum, one engine, to sharing the journey on a shared public transport vehicle.
And Hugh, that does sound amazing. I can picture it easily, but I mean, have you found a gold nugget under the post office? It's still going to cost a bit of money. How are you going to get that happening, do you think, while people are still needing to drive backwards and forwards before the tram gets built? I don't want to rain on your parade. It sounds like an amazing idea, but I'm just wondering what kind of policy moves might be needed to get it there.
You have to start with the community, and the community invests in the project. And then gradually you co-opt government. Government took away the last 18 kilometres of the Snowy Mountains Highway. It used to run all the way to Tathra. Just a little sleight of hand moved it to a council responsibility. We want that money back as the foundation for converting the corridor, pre-existing, with the power already running down it, to a dedicated rail line. When we get that money back, backing the community capital, then the employment creation that comes from this project, that in turn, when you add the ticketing system, your ticket on this tram is not one-way return, fortnightly, monthly. It is an annual membership. You get your little green card. If you're then able to go and get the 15% discount at all participating local businesses, who then get the increased turnover.
Wow. So, Hugh, you have put a lot of thought into this. That's a really interesting idea. And I think it really highlights how you can have leadership at one level, but you need buy-in from different levels too. I really hope we see that ultralight tram happening around Tathra. Gail, next in Melbourne. Gail, you've got a story of community leadership as well. What's happening there?
Hi, Hilary. Yeah, my friend Helen and I have come up with a big idea, and that is we're developing an initiative to get associations across Australia to be active and leading in their sectors. There's some 4,000 associations in Australia from business, industry, professional and community, and we think that they're the missing segment of the climate work target. So, there's already a lot of action with governments at all levels, across companies and within the community and households. But the thing is that associations have got many, many members. They understand their sector and they can drive initiatives across their membership. But at the moment, we don't think that there's much support for them.
And we really need that engagement, don't you, Gail? As you say, people who know their communities and can actually reach out and have those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been developing this initiative for a while, and we've started talks with a number of big players who are actually very interested in it. So we've talked to people from the Food and Grocery Council, from the Australian Industry Group, the Centre for Corporate Responsibility, Climate Works, and they're all getting on board to help us develop it. So this has really just come from two people who got together last year after the bushfires. Now, my friend Helen is a sustainability expert, so she's got a good network of people there. But I think it's just the concept that has captured people's interest.
Indeed. Gail, more power to you. I would love to hear an update at some point in the future. Thank you.
Well, thanks.
Another caller from Melbourne, Jack, welcome to you. Tell us about the organisation you're involved in.
Hilary, I'm not involved in this organisation, but I've heard about it and I've slipped some money to it.
Ah.
And it has a most interesting approach. People who are interested in the environment and want to gain more knowledge, gain it from this organisation, which is called Climate for Change. So I guess it's almost like a tutoring organisation. But the most impressive thing that I noticed was that they help people understand how to relate to other people who might have quite divergent views, so that it doesn't end in a standoff when you discuss the issue.
Yes,
So
you really need that back and forth, don't you?
Yes, so that you might run into somebody at whatever level and suddenly the horns are out and people are at each other. So they teach actually how to assess the person you're talking to and how you might approach them and at what level.
Oh, really interesting.
The organisation is Climate for Change, and they're fundraising at the moment, and people who've got a few bucks look it up and put some money in. They also do quite a lot of work in Gippsland, where they have a great publication and they have anecdotes of various people who are involved in activities down there.
It's really interesting to hear about. Thank you, Jack. I want to go to Matt Gambier next. Teresa, our final caller, I think. Teresa, tell us your thoughts on leadership around climate change.
Well, about leadership, it's actually the government, because they have been very reluctant to do anything about changes. It's too convenient to be plugged into the petroleum and coal lobbies. My husband, after returning from Fiji, we went to West Australia, and Bob, my husband, wrote the first environmental studies curriculum for the university there to prove that the problem we are facing were enormous.
And Teresa, just quickly, because I know we're short on time, do you feel that your husband's, the work that he did has had an impact? His leadership has had an impact throughout the years?
It did. For about 15 years in West Australia, they formed a building company which built about 120 solar houses. It is possible to have a perfectly comfortable house throughout the whole year without having to burn any fossils.
And now we're seeing that happen all around Australia. Teresa, thank you. I want to go to our guest before we wind up. John Lydon, from your point of view as the co-chair of the Climate Leaders Coalition, why is it important that businesses are involved in climate discussions? Because a lot of people see that many businesses rely on the status quo and would suffer from strong emissions targets. Is it just greenwashing to have them at the table or have them involved in these kinds of discussions?
Well, I can't speak for all business, but certainly the 33 members of the Climate Leaders Coalition, they truly believe that they have to lead us to a low-carbon future. Their employees are telling them, their customers are telling them, the communities and they operate are telling them, and increasingly investors are too. So first of all, business knows it has to act. And then every one of our CEOs, when they talk very personally about what this means to them, they've got personal stories too. They genuinely need to lead, listen, learn and lead business and the world to a better place.
I did notice one of our callers mentioning AGL, who's one of your members, and being involved in fracking and having to pull back on that. So it sounds like there's still a way to go when looking at across the board operations for some of the businesses in your group.
Look, I can't speak about individual businesses. All I'd say is look at the case studies in our roadmap 2030. That's just out last month. I know lots of things have happened years ago in the past, but look at what these companies are committing to now. But more than that, look at what they're doing now. And hopefully there'll be some inspiring stories, just like those inspiring stories of community leadership we've heard today.
And as we've heard, it does take input from lots of different sectors, doesn't it? You can't do it without business as well. Dr. Christian Downey, you've researched how states change their negotiating position and what agreements they're willing to sign in our last 30 seconds or so. How might that play out in Glasgow?
Well, I just wanted to say that, there's so much, of course, as your listener said, about what communities and individuals can do. But why Glasgow is so important is because what we really need, if we're going to get action in the time that's needed, is for states to take leadership. Only states can marshal the resources, have the legitimacy to transform economies, within decades. So we need state policies that grow our clean energy industries and do so at speed. We need ambitious targets, for our power sector, our transport sector, like one of your listeners mentioned, and our manufacturing sectors. We can't rely on businesses and markets alone. And I just want to give you one quick example. Think about electric vehicles. It's so great what's happening with electric vehicles. But if we left it to the market, General Motors started making them about 20 years ago, Tesla more than 10 years ago, and electric vehicle sales in the US still make up only 2% of total car sales. In Australia, it's less than 1%. So what we need is states to write the rules of the game, back it up with billions of investments and force business to come along. Hopefully, if the US and China can come on board, we'll see some of those rules of the game written in Glasgow and things will look a little bit better in 2 weeks. And I know that's what I think many of us are hoping for.
Indeed. And as we've heard from John, a lot of businesses are committing publicly to doing something. What that might be, you'd have to check the roadmap to find out. John Lydon's the co-chair of the Climate Leaders Coalition, and Dr. Christian Downey is from ANU, Associate Professor in the School of Regulation and Global Governance. Michael McKenzie, what have you got?
Oh, I've been swamped, absolutely swamped. Here's a little idea or example of what's been happening. This texter says, please have another program on climate change. It's amazing. In contrast, a texter says, all I'm hearing is the bleating of sheep. Nuclear power now. Jean says, thank you for today's thoughtful discussion. It really does highlight the vacuous technology, not taxes mantra. Your guests and listeners have correctly identified the important role of individuals, communities, regulation or incentives and the investment that follows. Technology is just a part of the change mix. Martha in Castlemaine says, if I felt ill, would I listen to a politician? No. I would ask my GP. If I had questions about climate, would I listen to a politician? No. I would ask a climate scientist who would be independent of fossil fuel companies. No brainer. Kathleen writes on Facebook, and I just thought this is worth mentioning in light of a call we had earlier from Hugh, I think. My friend Joe Dodds is representing us at COP26 right now as the president of Bushfire Survivors for Climate Action. Joe has been a part of our local council in the Bega Valley for the last 5 years. She is one ordinary woman standing up and out to bring the voice of so many to the world's leaders. I am so proud of her.
Thanks, Michael.
Cheers.
You're listening to Life Matters on Radio National.
Hi, Patricia Carvelis here. Join me each weekday afternoon from 6 to get a fresh perspective on the day's top national and international stories, current affairs, arts, culture and, of course, federal politics as we roll on towards the federal election. Plus, all the stories getting Australia talking. That's RN Drive with me, Patricia Carvelis, each weekday afternoon from 6 or anytime on the ABC Listen app. RN. Think bigger.
Life Matters has got mail.
Yes, let's start with last Monday's talkback on where to now for living with COVID, Michael.
Yes, Ruth emailed to say your program on Monday discussed the clear need for a national, not state-based response to living with the virus. I couldn't agree more, she says. As states open up, there appear to be different rules with no clear evidence base. For example, says Ruth, New South Wales allows entry by road to all without the need for testing. When those of us in northern New South Wales can eventually drive over the Queensland border to visit our families, it seems not only do we have to be double vaxxed, which I have no issue with, she says, but also have a clear COVID test taken in the last 72 hours. This need for a test, says Ruth, on top of evidence of double vax status, is going to prove a logistical nightmare. All testing centres operate only in business hours. The demand for tests just across the border will put an extra strain on the testing centres. And with the Queensland border opening up just before Christmas, says Ruth, it's likely test results will be delayed. Sigh.
Yes. And Sue writes, we live in WA. Why is WA the only state that's limiting the use of rapid antigen testing to people engaged in transport and logistics? Another example of national inconsistency. While Bill said, thank you for the two speakers today. They were clear, articulate and spoke from a strong evidence base. They appreciated the complexity of the issues, avoided simplistic responses, but offered hope for a future living with COVID. And if you did miss that talkback, the two guests were Professor Brendan Crabb, Director and CEO of the Burnet Institute, and Professor Adrian Esterman, Chair of Biostatistics and Epidemiology at the University of South Australia. You can find the audio on the ABC Listen app.
On the subject of women's health and particularly sexual health and how it still feels like a taboo, Grazia wrote to say, my husband, Dr. Graham Dennistein, ran a multidisciplinary clinic in vulva diseases. We did a lot of research together, and she says, I lead the counselling section of that clinic, and Grazia says, I concluded that the diagnosis of female sexual disorders, let me just come back to that there, in the DSM were culturally, artificially constructed and inappropriate. Grazia says, I am now writing a play based on my research on female sexual issues, including relationship issues. I'm not surprised, she says, that women still do not understand female sexuality.
But when it came to our discussion about fuel quality and electric vehicles, Joan was disappointed. She said our coverage was thin and out of date. She goes on to say, I've driven my EV now for 8.5 years, charged off my home using the solar system, and all I've paid for is a set of 2 front tyres and 2 windshield wipers. Best thing ever. She says, my strong message that I hope you can announce on your program is that if people are interested in learning what's really going on in EVs in Australia and around the world, cars, buses, trucks, boats, planes, they'll do no better than to sign up to the Australian newsletter named thedriven.io. She says there are articles almost daily on all the developments in EV tech. She cites the lead article at the time she wrote, which was the debut in Brisbane of the first hydrogen bus. She says 10 have been sold from mining companies to private bus charters. EV is happening in a big way now, she said.
Yum. And Tessa heard our talkback on various aspects of estate planning, including when your mum and dad just refused to make a will. Tessa suggests, in trying to get your parents to make a will, just make your own will. Show them how easy it is. No sweat. That'll show them.
Nice one. Well, thank you for all of your correspondence. We'll have more next Monday, Michael.
Yeah, that's right indeed. Thanks for that, Hilary.
Thank you. Michael and I will be back tomorrow, and I am very excited about this one because I get to speak with the wonderful Helen Garner. What can I say? She's a beautiful writer, and her latest book turns the lens back on herself again. It's the latest volume of her diaries, where she wrestles with the end of her marriage and the feelings of jealousy and anger and sadness and really exile that went with that. She's captured these tiny moments that make up a life, from the glowing and ordinary to the heart-wrenching and seismic ones too. Join me next time to hear what Helen Garner has learned from life on Life Matters.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio, and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.